At the edge of a shoreline where the tide has just drawn back, there is a god standing on flat, wet stone. The water has left its marks, shallow pools in the rock, a line of dark weed at the tide's limit, the particular smell of salt and cold, and the open sea beyond. His name is Njord, and in the Norse tradition, he is the god of coastal winds and sea wealth, of the winds that come off the water carrying the smell of fish and the sound of rigging, of the particular kind of prosperity that belongs to people who live close enough to the sea to make their living from it. He stands where the land ends and something else begins, and that threshold between the solid and the moving, between the ground and the deep, is where the story of his daughter first takes shape. The Norse tradition belongs to the people of Scandinavia and Iceland, to the skalds who composed verse in the old meters, and the storytellers who carried the older material forward. And what it holds about its gods is large and intricate, and sometimes fragmentary, surviving in manuscripts copied in Iceland during the 12th and 13th centuries from material much older. The two great collections are called the Prose Edda and the Poetic Edda, and between them they preserve the names and the deeds and the origins of the divine figures who inhabited the Norse cosmos, a cosmos built not from nothing, but from the collision of opposites, from fire and ice, from the bodies of primordial giants, from the slow making of a world that the gods tended and disputed and wandered through. Into this world Njord belongs, standing at his shoreline, with the tide moving away over stone, and from him his daughter comes. She is named Freya, and she is the goddess the Norse tradition most consistently associates with love, with desire, with magic, with beauty, with the particular practice known as scyther, and with the receiving of the honored dead. Her name, in the oldest form available to scholars, derives from the Proto-Germanic word fryo, which carried the meaning of lady or noblewoman, a term of address, a title of rank, a word for a woman of high standing in the social order that produced it. The Old High German asterisk, fruva asterisk, comes from the same root, and from asterisk fruva asterisk descends the modern German word, asterisk fro, asterisk, which is simply the ordinary word for a woman, for a wife, for the standard honorific placed before a woman's name, in formal address. What was once a goddess's title has moved through centuries of Germanic speech and arrived, worn smooth by daily use, in a language spoken by millions of people who are unlikely to think of a Norse goddess when they say it. The word that names her carried that distance inside it before anyone thought to look. She is not an Aesir goddess. This distinction, which the Norse tradition maintained carefully, matters for understanding who she is and where she comes from. The divine population of the Norse cosmos was divided into two principal tribes, the Aesir and the Vanir, and these two tribes, for a time, were at war. The Alir were led by Odin and included among their number Thor, Tyr, and Bald, figures associated with the kind of divine power that maintains order and defends the world and meets force with force. The Vanir were associated with something different, with fertility and prosperity and the deep generative forces that make crops grow and herds multiply and the sea yield its harvest. Freya belongs to the Vanir, so does her father Njord. So does her twin brother Freyr, whose name is simply the Old Norse word for lord, forming a direct counterpart to her title of lady, brother, and sister, each wearing the title of their sex, as though the tradition reached for the simplest and most complete names it had. The conflict between the Aesir and the Vanir, preserved in both the Prose Edda and the Ynglinga saga, ended not in conquest, but in truce. The two tribes exchanged gods, and the exchanged figures lived among their former enemies as a guarantee of peace. This is what the tradition calls a mutual exchange of divine hostages, and the arrangement is described in those sources as settled and concluded, a fact of mythological geography rather than an ongoing wound. Njord went to live among the Aesir, Freya went to live among the Aesir, and Freya went to live among the Aesir, carrying with her the particular nature she had always had, her Vanir knowledge, her Vanir magic, her Vanir relationship to the generative forces of the world. She arrived in Asgard already herself, already fully formed, already the goddess of everything the Vanir tradition had made her. The world she moved through is worth settling into slowly, because the Norse cosmos is a particular kind of place, organized, interconnected, held within a structure that gives each part of it a name and a position relative to all the others. At the center of the structure is Yggdrasil, the great ash tree whose roots reach into multiple realms and whose branches spread above them all, connecting what would otherwise have nothing in common. Asgard, the home of the Aesir gods, sits within this cosmos as one of several interconnected realms, linked to Midgard, the world of human beings, by the rainbow bridge Bifrost. Jotunheim, the realm of the giants, lies at another reach of the tree. Niflheim, the realm associated with cold and mist and a particular kind of death, lies elsewhere still. The Norse cosmos is not arranged as a hierarchy of above and below, so much as an interconnected geography of distinct places, each with its own character and its own rules, all of them somehow contained within the same vast structure. Into this cosmos, Freya came from the Vanir side of the old divide, and she settled into it with a domain of her own. The realm belonging to her is called Folkvangra, and its name encodes plainly what it is. The Old Norse word asterisk, folk, asterisk, carries the sense of a host or a people, a gathering of many, a multitude assembled, and asterisk vangr. Asterisk means field or plain, an open and outdoor expanse rather than an enclosed hall or a fortified city. Folkvangr is in its very name a field where many gather, not a throne room, not a fortress, not a place of gates and walls and carefully restricted entry, a field wide, outdoor, open to the sky, defined by the presence of the people it holds, rather than by any structure built to contain them. The Norse tradition, as it survives in the Prose Edda's Gylfaginning, describes Freya's association with this place, matter-of-factly, as a settled feature of the cosmological arrangement. Odin speaks of it in the Eddic poem Grimnismal in terms that give it parity with his own realm, and the terms he uses are plain and unelaborated, as though Folkvangr needs no special argument for its importance. It simply exists, where it has always existed, doing what it was made to do. The field stretches outward in whatever direction a mythological field stretches, which is to say, it stretches as far as its name requires, and its name requires enough room for the host of people the tradition has always understood to gather there. Standing within Folkvangr is a hall. Its name is Sessrumnir, and this name is worth sitting with, because it is a name that describes what the hall is, rather than who built it, or what events occurred inside it, or what the walls are made of. The word Sessrumnir is a compound, and its components are asterisk, Sess asterisk, meaning seat or bench, the specific kind of seating one finds arranged along the walls of a Norse hall, and room, meaning roomy or spacious, having ample room, built wide enough for what it needs to contain. Sessrumnir is in the most literal sense the hall that has room for many seats, not the hall of the golden doors, not the hall of the high seat, not a name that gestures toward grandeur or exclusivity or the careful limiting of who enters and who remains outside. A hall named for the fact that it is big enough and roomy enough, and has enough seats for those who arrive and sit and remain. The Prose Edda describes Sessrumnir in Gylfaginning as large and beautiful. Both of those qualities matter, but they matter differently. Large is a fact about capacity. The hall can hold what it needs to hold, which the tradition tells us is many, which is why Falkvanger's field extends to encompass the host implied by its name. Beautiful is a fact about quality. The hall is not merely functional, not merely adequate, not built for efficiency, without regard for how it presents itself to those who enter. It is beautiful and large, and the tradition gives those qualities together as though spaciousness and beauty are not competing attributes, but natural companions, the one supporting the other. In the Norse understanding of the cosmos, the halls of the gods are not merely architectural features. They are expressions of the gods themselves, their character, their concerns, their relationship to what they receive and protect and preside over. Odin's hall Valhalla, whose name means the hall of the slain, is described with its rows of shields hanging from its walls, its roof thatched with spear shafts, its host of warriors feasting and fighting in preparation for the great battle the tradition describes as coming at the end of the current age. Valhalla is martial in its every detail, from its construction to its inhabitants to the cycle of their days. Sessrumnir offers no such detailed description in the surviving sources. It is large and beautiful, standing in its field, and the tradition does not elaborate further on what happens inside it, or how its walls are arranged, or what hangs from its rafters. This relative sparseness of description is itself a kind of information. The Norse tradition was not unable to describe divine halls in detail. The account of Valhalla demonstrates that clearly enough. When Sessrumnir receives a briefer account, the brevity is not an accident of transmission, but a feature of what the tradition chose to preserve. The hall is large enough, it is beautiful, it stands in its field. These three things are what the sources offer, and they are offered without apology or elaboration, as though they are sufficient, which in the tradition's terms they appear to be. Freya's presence in the Norse cosmos sits at the intersection of several things the tradition valued and found difficult to categorize within a single frame. She is associated with love and desire, with the particular force that draws one person toward another, that makes longing possible, that sits at the origin of the specifically human experience of being compelled by something outside the self. She is associated with beauty, with what is precious and luminous and worth wanting. She is associated with magic, with the specific and demanding practice of Seidr, which the Ynglinga saga names her as the first to bring to the Aesir, placing her at the origin of the deepest magical tradition the Norse cosmos contains. She is associated with war and with death, not because she is a goddess of destruction, but because the Norse tradition gave her a role as one of those who chooses which of the battle dead belong to her, keeping and brings them to her hall. And she is associated with grief, with the particular grief of absence, of something precious gone from where it should be. All of this belongs to her, and the tradition holds it together within the figure of a single goddess without apparent strain, as though the Norse cosmos found nothing contradictory in placing love and war, and magic and death and beauty and grief within the same divine being. This is worth noting, not because it is unusual for divine figures to carry multiple attributes. It is in fact quite common across traditions, but because the particular combination is distinctly her own, and it colors everything the tradition records about her. She moves through the Norse cosmos as a figure whose domains touch each other at unexpected angles, whose role as a chooser of the dead sits beside her role as the goddess of love, without canceling either, whose expertise in the practice that can alter fate exists alongside her function as the lady of a wide and welcoming field. Before her name appeared in any source, before the manuscripts that preserve the Eddas were copied in their Icelandic scriptoria, before the skalds shaped their kennings around her attributes, long before any of that, the word Frajo was already moving through the Germanic languages, wearing down to something simpler, something less divine, something that could be applied to any woman of standing, and eventually to any woman at all. Language carries its histories inside it, whether or not the speakers know they are there, and the word for Freya moved through centuries, becoming the word for Frau, the goddess's title, becoming the ordinary address, the divine name becoming the courteous greeting. What she was, the language preserved in the word, even after the word had forgotten what it was preserving. The Vanir, from whom she came, were understood in the Norse tradition as a distinct group of divine beings, not lesser than the Aesir, but differently oriented, concerned with the kinds of power that operate quietly in the background of things, rather than the kind that fights and commands and imposes order through force. The fertility of the soil, the wealth that comes up from the sea, the generative energies that make the world continue to produce, these are Vanir concerns. Njord, the father, is their exemplar, a god of the sea winds and coastal prosperity, of the harbor and the fish run and the successful voyage home, of all the quiet and reliable forms of abundance that come from knowing the water and working with it. From a god of this kind, the tradition gives us Freya, and the inheritance shows in the domains she carries. Love and desire are forms of fertility. Beauty is a form of abundance. The capacity to alter fate through magical practice is the Vanir quality of deep knowledge applied to the most fundamental forces operating in the world. The exchange that brought her to Asgard, that settled the Aesir-Vanir war, and redistributed the divine population between the two tribes, placed Freya in a new setting without removing the nature she carried. She became, in the language of the tradition, an Aesir goddess, one of the gods of Asgard, counted among the residents of that realm, without ceasing to be Vanir in her origin and in the particular character that origin gave her. The tradition does not present this as a tension she carries or a conflict she negotiates. It is simply what she is, Vanir born, Asgard dwelling, occupant of a field and hall that are neither Aesir nor Vanir in their character, but entirely her own. Njord, standing at his coastline, with the tide gone back over flat rock, is the first image the tradition offers before Freya is named. He is there where the sea meets the land, where the solid world ends and the water begins its long work of going away and returning. And from that threshold, his daughter comes into the Norse cosmos, carrying the qualities of her Vanir lineage, the generative, the magnetic, the deeply knowing. The twin children of a sea god inherit the sea's qualities in the tradition's account, not the sea's violence, not its capacity for shipwreck and disaster, but its depth and its wealth and its patient recurring presence. The tide goes out and comes back. The fish return to the same waters. The harbor fills again with what was expected. These are Njord's domains, and from them Freya comes, already herself, already carrying what the tradition will spend many poems and many saga passages slowly elaborating. The Aesir-Vanir War, as the sources describe it, ended in a particular way that the Norse tradition found significant, not in the victory of one side and the defeat of the other, not in an arrangement that left one tribe subordinate to the other. The truce between the two groups of gods was sealed by an exchange of persons, each side giving gods to the others keeping, and the exchange was mutual. The Aesir sent Honir and Mimir to the Vanir. The Vanir sent Njord and his children Freyr and Freya to the Aesir. Both sides gave something they valued, and both sides received something in return, and the war was over. The tradition records this as a settled fact, a piece of mythological geography, rather than an ongoing grief. The gods who were exchanged belong now to the places they were sent, and the arrangement stands. Freya's name in this exchange is the Old Norse word for lord, the straightforward masculine title for a person of high rank, plain and unadorned. Freya's name is its feminine counterpart, the word for lady, for noble woman, for a woman of standing. Brother and sister sent together from their father's world into the world of the Aesir, each wearing a name that is not quite a personal name, but a title, a description of rank, of standing, of the kind of being each of them is. The tradition may have had other names for them, older names, names that the material no longer preserves. What survives is the title, used as a name, worn so long as a name that the distinction no longer matters. She is the lady, and the lady is her. The Proto-Germanic Fraujo was used to address a woman of high social standing, someone whose rank placed her above the ordinary and required a particular form of address in return. That word, moving through Old High German as asterisk fro, a asterisk became the Middle High German asterisk fro, a asterisk became the modern asterisk fro, traveled from the halls of early Germanic societies through the centuries of language change, and arrived as the polite and entirely secular form of address, used in letters and offices and hospitals and schools. A goddess's title, worn smooth by 1,000 years of ordinary use, still moving through the language, the divine presence worn away to a courtesy. The tradition that named her is the oldest layer of that word, and the word is still there. Folkfang, the field of the host, the wide outdoor gathering place that is her realm, receives in the surviving sources a kind of description that communicates by omission as much as by statement. The texts that describe Asgard's various realms give some of them walls and gates and specific architectural features that carefully organize structures of divine settlements. Folkfang receives a name that means field, and the sources do not contradict that name with described walls or enclosed spaces. It is a field, a wide outdoor place, a landscape defined by openness rather than enclosure, by the absence of the structures that would limit who enters and who remains outside. Her realm is as permeable as its name suggests, a place that holds many precisely because it does not close itself against them. The tradition that Froa chose half of the battle slain is recorded in Grimnismal in Odin's own account of the various divine realms, and it sits in that account without particular emphasis, offered matter-of-factly among other settled facts of cosmological arrangement. Odin takes half, Froa takes half. The field of Folkvangr holds her portion, and Sessrumnir stands within the field to receive them. That is the arrangement, and it has apparently always been the arrangement, existing before the oldest sources thought to write it down, encoded in the cosmos as a feature of how things work, rather than as a story about something that happened once. The Hall Sessrumnir, standing in its field, carries its meaning in its name in the way that the best Norse names do, precisely without ornament, saying what the thing is rather than associating it with a dramatic history or a famous resident. A seat-roomy hall, a hall with room for seats, room for the seated, room for the many who arrive and settle and remain. The name does not promise grandeur. It does not promise combat or transformative experience or the kind of preparation for future battle that defines existence in Valhalla. It promises room. It promises that what arrives will be received, that what sits will have space to sit, that the hall was built wide enough for what comes to it. The prose Edda adds that it is large and beautiful, and those qualities together, spacious and beautiful, suggest a place that was built with genuine care for those it would hold. The Norse cosmos in which Sessrumnir stands is old beyond the kind of oldness that history measures. The sources that preserve these accounts were written in the 12th and 13th centuries, but the material they preserve was already old then, carried in oral tradition, shaped by skalds composing in meters that themselves implied older forms, rooted in beliefs and cosmological understandings that predated the Christianization of Scandinavia and Iceland by centuries. When the prose Edda describes Folkvanger in Sessrumnir, it is reaching back through that oral tradition, through those older forms, towards something that was already ancient when the scribes set it down. The field was there before the description. The hall was there before the word was written. Freya, daughter of the coastal god, twin of the Lord, bearer of the title that became an ordinary word, she arrived in the Norse cosmos already what she would continue to be. Her Vanir origins did not leave her when she crossed into Asgard. They traveled with her, part of her nature, as settled and inalienable as the name the tradition uses for her. She is the lady of the wide field. She is the one whose hall was built large enough for many. She is the one who came from the sea god's world and carried that world's qualities, depth, generativity, wealth, the patient returning of things, into the realm of the Aesir, and held them there, all of them, without diminishment. The detail that Njord is a god of coastal wealth is worth staying with for a moment, because it names a very specific kind of wealth, not the wealth of the cultivated land, not the wealth of the mined earth, but the wealth that comes from the boundary between elements, from the place where the sea gives up what the land cannot produce on its own. Fish, salt, amber, the trade routes that follow coastlines, the knowledge of weather that comes from watching the sea change its face. Njord's wealth is edge wealth, boundary wealth, the particular abundance that belongs to those who live where two worlds meet and understand how to work that meeting. From a god of that kind of wealth, a daughter who moves across boundaries between divine tribes, between the living and the dead, between the ordinary and the magical, comes with a kind of genealogical logic. Logic? The exchange that settled the Aesir-Vanir War was a permanent exchange, not a temporary loan. Njord and his children did not return to the Vanir when the truce had been confirmed. They stayed. Freyr became one of the Aesir gods and received his own realm within the Norse cosmos. Njord settled into his role among the Aesir, and Freya settled into hers, into the ownership of a field and a hall, into the practice of her magic, into the full exercise of the attributes the tradition gave her. She did not become Aesir in the sense of becoming someone other than what she had been. She became Aesir in the geographical sense. She lived among them, was counted among them, was received as one of the gods of Asgard. But the Vanir nature traveled with her, and the sources that preserve her attributes preserve those attributes without suggesting they were modified or diminished by the relocation. The field of Folkvanger, whose name gathers the word for people and the word for plain, and holds them together in a name that is almost a description of what it is, a place where many people are, spread across open ground, is a realm defined by its capacity. It can hold a host. The word asterisk folk asterisk carries inside it the plurality, the multitude, the gathered many. The word asterisk vangra asterisk carries inside it the open expanse, the unenclosed outdoor landscape, the space that can expand as the host expands because it is not bounded by walls. A field can hold as many as come to it. That is the logic of the name, and that is the logic of the realm. The Norse tradition did not place Freya's receiving of the dead in tension with her role as a goddess of love and desire and beauty. The tradition held all of it together within the same figure, as though the connection between love and loss, between what is most precious and what must eventually be given up, was not a contradiction requiring resolution, but a pattern that a goddess of sufficient depth could contain and hold. What is loved can be lost. What is lost can be received in a field large enough, in a hall roomy enough, by a goddess whose name means the one who is the lady of it all. The tradition found in Freya a figure capacious enough for that, and built her a hall to match. So the Rumnir stands in Folkvangr with its wide walls and its roomy interior, beautiful and large in the sources that describe it, defined by its capacity for welcome rather than by any feature that would limit or restrict or exclude. Its name is a compound of seat and spacious, and those two words together make a kind of promise: room for the seated, room for those who arrive and remain, room for as many as the field outside holds in its wide plain. The hall was built not to be impressive in the way of locked doors and defended approaches. It was built to be adequate to what it holds, and what it holds is whatever half of the honored dead Freya chose from each battle's offering. That is a great many across all the time the tradition describes, and the hall's name suggests it was always built to accommodate that many. The field continues around it, as fields do, without particular ceremony. The grass is there, the space is there, the open sky above a plain in the Norse cosmos, whatever color that sky is, in whatever season the tradition imagines, Folkvangr to rest in. These things persist in the description without being described, because the name does the describing. A field of the host, a field where many gather, a hall with room for seats. The tradition encoded in these names, a place of quiet abundance, of generous reception, of the kind of spaciousness that does not call attention to itself, but simply is adequate to what arrives. The word sessrumnir, seat roomy, built wide enough for what comes to it, is the last thing the tradition offers before it moves forward into other parts of Freya's story. It stands there in its field, large and beautiful, doing what its name describes, holding what it was built to hold, the grass of Folkvangr extending outward in whatever direction the Norse cosmos extends, unhurried and wide and quietly sufficient for the many it was always going to receive. The hall has room for seats. It has always had room for seats. That is what it is called, and that is what it is, and the field around it continues in the way that wide fields continue, when nothing particular is happening in them, simply present, simply open, simply the kind of place that was built to hold many, and finds in the holding exactly the purpose it was built for. The word *Valshammer* breaks apart into two older, simpler things, *Valfer*, falcon, *Hummer*, skin, or shape. Held together, the compound describes something that is neither a costume nor a disguise, but a genuine second form, a falcon shape that can be worn the way a body wears its own outline, fitted close and fully inhabited. The second half of the word, *ham, is the one worth turning over slowly, because in the Norse understanding of what a person was and how a person could move through the world, the *ham, was not simply an outer surface. It was the form, a being projected into the world, a shape with its own presence, its own way of moving, its own knowledge of how to do the things that shape could do. To put on an *, hammer * was not to disguise the self, but to extend it, to send it out into the world wearing a different architecture. A falcon's asterisk ham asterisk would know the air. It would know the angle of a thermal and the exact narrowing of the eye required to track something small moving below through a vast and moving landscape. Whatever self stepped into that shape would have access for the duration of wearing it to all of that. The cloak that Freya kept, the asterisk Valshammer asterisk, was this kind of thing. It was not feathers sewn onto cloth. It was not a disguise worn at the edge of a story to make a god temporarily unrecognizable. The tradition holds it as a genuine instrument, something that functioned according to the Norse understanding of what shapes were and what it meant to inhabit one fully. This places the asterisk Valshammer asterisk within a broader category of practice that Old Norse sources name asterisk Hamfara asterisk travel in an assumed form, the sending of awareness and presence into a body that is not one's own. The practice appears across the Eddic and saga literature in enough different contexts and with enough consistency of understanding that it seems to have been a recognized thing, a named capability within the world the Norse tradition describes, neither surprising nor requiring special explanation when it appeared. The asterisk Valshammer asterisk was a particularly refined version of this. It was a made object rather than a skill performed directly from the self. Someone had shaped it, given it form and function, and Freya kept it in her hall in Folkvang, available. That availability is part of what the sources record. Both of the myths in which the asterisk Valshammer asterisk appears most fully involve Loki borrowing it, taking it from Freya's keeping, and flying out on its wings in service of some errand that required the kind of speed and passage only a falcon could manage. And in both cases, Freya gives the cloak willingly. There is no resistance in the telling, no moment of reluctance. The cloak passes from her hands to Loki's with the matter-of-fact quality of a useful thing being lent to someone who needs it. What this says about the cloak and about the relationship between Freya and Loki within the tradition, and about the kind of trust that exists between figures who inhabit the same mythological world, is worth sitting with, though the texts do not say it aloud. They simply record the lending twice and let the repetition speak for whatever it contains. The first of these loans appears in the Prose Edda's Skaldska Parmal, in the myth that concerns Idun, the goddess who keeps the apples that prevent the Aesir from aging. Idun had been taken. A giant named Jazi had arranged her abduction, and without her apples, the gods in Asgard were beginning to feel what the Norse tradition understood as the natural direction of all things left untended: age, diminishment, the slow withdrawal of what the world needed to sustain its best condition. The asterisk had traced the problem to Loki, and Loki, facing the assembled gods' displeasure, had agreed to retrieve her. To do that, he needed to fly into the territories of the giants, deep into Jotunheimer, where Jazi kept his hall, required something faster and more capable than a human form could manage. So Loki came to Freya and asked for the asterisk Valshammer asterisk, and Freya lent it, and Loki put it on and lifted away from Asgard on borrowed falcon wings. The journey out is described simply. Loki flew to Jazi's hall. The giant was away from home, out at sea, the Prose Edda says, and Idun was inside, alone. Loki found her there. The transformation that follows is itself a small example of the Norse tradition's understanding of shape and form. Loki, already wearing the asterisk Valshammer asterisk and inhabiting the falcon's shape, transformed Idun into a nut and lifted her in his talons and flew with her back toward Asgard. The nut is not a disguise, not a trick of appearance meant to fool an inattentive eye. It is, within the logic of the tradition, a genuine transformation, a changed shape, a different asterisk hammer asterisk settled over Idon's form for the duration of the flight. Two shapes at once in this scene. Then the falcon that is Loki wearing the asterisk Valshammer asterisk, and the nut that is Idon wearing a temporarily altered form. The myth places both within the same frame, without apparent tension, as though the layering of shapes is entirely legible. One more instance of the way forms can shift and be inhabited, and then released back to their original condition. Jawsey returned. He found his hall empty and understood what had happened, and he put on his own shape for flight. He was a giant who could take the form of an eagle and came after Loki across the sky. There is a chase in the myth, the eagle behind the falcon, and what it amounts to is a contest of speed and endurance across the mythological sky between a borrowed shape and a native one. The Aesir watching from Asgard saw the falcon coming and the eagle behind it, and prepared fire on the walls of Asgard. When Loki and Idon's nut cleared the walls, the fire caught Jawsey's wings. He fell, the myth resolves, and the borrowed cloak had served the purpose it was lent to serve. The gods ate Idon's apples again. Age receded, what had been beginning to diminish was restored, and the asterisk Volsharm asterisk went back to Freya's keeping. There is something worth noticing about the structure of that myth when attention is paid to what the asterisk Volsharm asterisk actually did and did not do. It carried Loki to Jotunheimer. It gave him the speed and capability of a falcon in flight. It allowed him to carry something, the transformed Idon, back across the distance between one part of the mythological world and another. The cloak was, in this telling, a tool of rescue and passage, but the rescue required other things alongside it: the transformation of Idon into a carried shape, the fire prepared on Asgard's walls, the cooperation of the watching gods. The asterisk Valshammer asterisk was necessary, but not sufficient. It could do what a falcon could do, move through the air with exceptional speed across enormous distances, and that was what was needed, and it was borrowed and returned. The transaction is clean and entirely practical. Freya owned a thing of considerable capability, and she let someone else use it, and it came back. The second loan appears in a different register. The poetic Edda poem Thrymskvida, the poem of Thrymr, opens with Thor waking to find Mjolnir gone. The hammer had been stolen in the night, buried 8 miles underground by the giant Thrym, who had taken it as a kind of ransom. He would return the hammer if the gods gave him Freya as his wife. The situation required reconnaissance before anything else. Someone needed to fly to Jotunheim, find out what had happened, understand the terms of the theft, bring that information back. Thor and Loki went together to Freya's hall and asked for the asterisk Valshammer. Asterisk. Freya said in the poem's telling that she would give it even if it were made of gold, even if it were made of silver. The poem adds, for emphasis. She handed it over. Loki put it on and flew. This is worth pausing on. Freya said she would give the cloak even if it were made of gold or silver, meaning the value of the cloak's use in this moment exceeds even the value of the cloak itself. She is not lending reluctantly. She is not performing generosity while feeling something more complicated underneath it. The tradition records her as giving freely, immediately, and with a kind of emphasis that makes the willingness felt. The asterisk Valshamar asterisk left her hall for the second time, and it flew to Jotunheimer, and the intelligence it brought back was the thing that set the rest of the myth's events in motion. Loki arrived at Thrymar's hall, wearing the falcon shape. The giant was sitting outside in a landscape the poem describes with some specificity, plaiting golden leashes for his hounds, trimming the manes of his horses. He saw the falcon arrive and asked whether it brought news from the Aesir or from the elves. Loki told him why he had come. Thrymr confirmed that he had buried Mjolnir 8 miles underground and that it would not come back until the gods sent him Freya. Loki flew back to Asgard with this information. The cloak had done what it could do, carry someone to the right place fast enough to get an answer, and carry them back. What came next? The plan the gods made, the solution they eventually found, the complicated series of events that returned Mjolnir to Thor, was not the Fallshammer's work. Its work was the approach, the arrival, the return. The myth of Thrymskvitha is often treated in scholarship as a comic poem, and the tradition supports this reading. The proposed solution involves dressing Thor in a wedding gown and veil, and sending him to Jotunheimr as a false bride, which produces several extended scenes of anxious comedy as the disguised Thor is required to eat, drink, and behave in ways that are difficult to make convincing. But the Fallshammer's role in the poem exists at a different register from the comedy. The cloak's loan and flight and return are the poem's machinery, the thing that makes everything else possible, and they have the practical, unhurried quality of a tool being used correctly. The humor comes later. The cloak enables it. What the two myths share, the recovery of Idun and the reconnaissance for Mjolnir, is worth noticing as a pattern. In both, Freya's asterisk Valshamr. Asterisk is the thing that can make a necessary journey happen. In both, Loki is the one who wears it. In both, the need is genuine. Asgard without Idun's apples is a Asgard moving toward diminishment, and Asgard without Mjolnir is an Asgard without its most important protection. The cloak is not borrowed for small purposes. It appears specifically in moments of real need, when the distance to be crossed is too great and too fast for anything else. This is not a coincidence of the myth's structure. It is in some sense a documentation of what the asterisk Valshamr asterisk was for, what kind of object it was within the Norse tradition's inventory of significant things. It was kept against the occasions that required it. Those occasions, the tradition records, arrived. The asterisk Hamfara asterisk tradition that the asterisk Valshamr asterisk belongs to, travel in animal shape, appears elsewhere in the Norse sources in forms that do not involve a made object, but instead involve the direct projection of the self into a second body. In the Ynglinga saga, Odin is described as capable of sending his spirit out from his body, while the body lay as though asleep, sending it into animals and traveling in those shapes across great distances. The practice is described as a recognized skill, something Odin had and exercised, connected explicitly to the kind of shamanic tradition that the Norse world documented. The asterisk Valshamr asterisk is a kind of externalization of this capacity, a made thing that allows the same kind of travel without requiring the practitioner to have achieved the internal discipline of the asterisk Hamfara asterisk tradition directly. To wear it is to have access to what it knows. To give it to someone is to give them, temporarily, that access. This makes the asterisk Valshamr asterisk unusual among the great made objects of Norse mythology. Mjolnir is Thor's weapon and belongs to him specifically. The myth of its theft is, at one level, a myth about what happens when the thing that defines a figure's particular power is taken away from its owner. Gungnir, Odin's spear, is his in the same way. These objects are identified with their owners. The asterisk Valshamr asterisk is not like that. It belongs to Freya. Its capabilities are entirely consonant with her nature, with the broader tradition of shape change and scyther magic and altered states that she embodies. and yet it is lent, given twice into hands that are not hers, in service of needs that are not personally hers. The cloak goes out into the mythological world wearing a different self inside it, and it comes back, and it is kept again. This is a particular quality among objects that could be called powerful. It is a tool of help rather than a tool of identity. Freya's relationship to the Valshammer within the sources is in this way defined more by the giving than by the keeping. The texts that record the cloak's 2 loans do not describe what it looks like in her hall between those loans. They do not describe how she came to have it, or how it was made, or what it felt like to wear. What they record is the 2 moments of lending, and in those moments a quality of generosity, without ceremony, a willingness to release the tool to the need. The poetic Edda's emphasis that she would give it, even if it were gold, even if it were silver, is a kind of characterization. It says something about Freya's understanding of what the cloak was worth, which is to say, her understanding of what things are actually valuable and in what circumstances. The thing was valuable, the need was greater, the cloak went. There is a texture in the Valshamart myths that is worth dwelling in for a moment, the texture of the falcon's specific knowledge. Whatever self wore the cloak in flight would have had the falcon's knowledge of the air. This is different from the knowledge a human or a god carries as their own. The falcon's knowledge of the air is entirely practical and entirely embodied. The way the wing angles to catch and use the thermal, the way the eye narrows to track movement across distance, the way the hollow bones carry the body's weight differently than the heavy skeleton of something that cannot fly. None of this is abstract knowledge. It cannot be read about or told. It lives in the shape, and so to put on the Valshamar. Was, in the Norse understanding, to have access to a form of intelligence that was not one's own, the falcon's particular way of understanding the world it moved through. This is part of what Homer meant, and part of what Homfara involved, and part of what made the Valshamar something more than a means of transportation. The cold of Jotunheimer would have been in the cloak's feathers after the first loan. The poem does not say this, but the logic of the tradition suggests it. The Valshammer that had crossed the distance between Asgard and the Hall of Jazi, that had arrived in a landscape the Norse world imagined as deep and cold and far from the ordered center of things, would have brought something of that distance back in its form. Not contamination, not damage, but the specific character of having been somewhere. The second loan took it to Jotunheimer again, to Thrymir's hall, where the giant sat with his golden leashes and his horses, somewhere in the vast and cold landscape the Norse tradition imagined beyond the boundary of the god's world. The cloak arrived there as a falcon and asked its question and returned. Twice now it had gone out to where the giants lived and come back to where Freya kept it. The consistency of the cloak's use across both myths, always Loki, always Jotunheimer, always a genuine emergency, creates a pattern that feels less like coincidence and more like the tradition's way of documenting what the Valshammer was actually used for, not for Freya's own journeys, at least not in the surviving sources, not for decoration or display, for the specific kind of passage that required a falcon's speed and a falcon's capability across the vast distances of the Norse mythological world in service of the god's most pressing needs. The tradition holds Freya as the cloak's keeper and presents her keeping of it as something that benefits the wider world of the gods, not only herself. She has the thing that can do what other things cannot. When the need arrives, she gives it, there is something very quiet about this function, taken as a whole. The most dramatic movements in both myths, the chase across the sky, the flight to Thrymir's Hall, the return with Idun, depend entirely on the Valshammer's existence and availability. Remove it from either myth, and neither resolves. The gods age. The hammer stays buried. The object at the center of both solutions is kept in a hall in a wide field by a goddess who hands it over without hesitation when the need is real. This is a particular kind of power, the power of holding what is needed, of keeping it available, of understanding when to release it and into whose hands. The tradition records it in Freya's keeping without commentary, as though this too is simply something she does and has always done. The asterisk Valshammer asterisk appears consistently enough across the prose and poetic Edda that it registers as a well-established element of Freya's mythological character, rather than a late addition or a marginal detail. Both collections of Old Norse mythological material included. Both present it in the same basic configuration: Freya's cloak, Loki's loan, Jotunheimer's distance, the urgent errand, the return. The fact that the same object appears with the same function in two separate mythological traditions, one preserved in prose, one in verse, suggests it was settled enough in the tradition to survive whatever process of selection and recording shaped the surviving sources. The asterisk Valshammer asterisk was in some sense an expected part of Freya's inventory. It would have been present in the minds of whoever first heard these myths told, recognized before the telling reached it, a known thing being put to use again in a new story. The word asterisk hammer asterisk carries its own depth beyond the cloak. In the Norse understanding of the self, the asterisk hammer asterisk was one of several components that together constituted a being. Alongside it were the asterisk hugger asterisk, something like the mind or the conscious self, and the asterisk felgia asterisk, an attending spirit often imagined in animal form, linked to a person and visible in moments of significant transition. The asterisk ham or asterisk was the outermost of these, the form layer, the aspect of self that could be seen by others, and that in most cases remained fixed and recognizable. But in the asterisk ham or asterisk tradition, and in the logic of the asterisk Valsham or asterisk, the asterisk ham or asterisk could be changed, temporarily exchanged, a different form settled over the self, like a garment, with the difference that the Norse understanding of what a asterisk ham or asterisk was meant, that this exchange had genuine consequences for how the self could act and move and perceive. The cloak was not theatrical. It was a real alteration of a real layer of what a being was. Loki, who wore the asterisk Valshammer asterisk on both recorded occasions, was himself a figure for whom shape change was a native capability. The tradition records him changing form in multiple other contexts, without any external tool, by the direct exercise of whatever it was in him that allowed this. That he needed to borrow the cloak at all is interesting. Perhaps the specific capability he needed, the endurance of sustained flight across the mythological distances to Jotunheim, the falcon's specific knowledge of the air, was beyond what his own shape change could produce reliably at speed. Perhaps the asterisk, Valshammer asterisk, was simply faster, more certain, more fully inhabited than an improvised falcon shape. The tradition does not explain this. It simply records that Loki came to Freya and asked, both times, and Freya gave the cloak, and Loki flew. Whatever the reason for the borrowing, the pattern holds. A figure who could, in principle, change his own shape came to Freya's hall to borrow hers. The return of the asterisk Valshamur asterisk after the second loan closes the circle of both myths quietly. After the reconnaissance, after the flight to Threemer's Hall and back, after the information had been gathered and the gods had made their complicated plan, and Mjolnir had eventually come home, the cloak had fulfilled its purpose. The poem Thrimskvida does not describe the return of the asterisk Valshammer asterisk explicitly. Its focus shifts to Thor and the disguise and the events in Threemer's Hall. But the logic of the tradition implies it. The cloak went back to Freya's keeping. It had been to Jotunheim twice now, carried on its feathers whatever the air of that distant landscape carried, performed the specific work of rapid passage and reconnaissance that was its function, and come home to a hall in a wide field, to the goddess who kept it. The asterisk Valshamur asterisk resting in Freya's hall, after its second return, carries something of both journeys in it, not metaphorically, but in the way that things used for important purposes carry the weight of those purposes forward. The cold of Jotunheimer would have been in the feathers, whatever the Norse tradition understood cold to be, in a landscape that was not quite geographical, but was entirely real. The distance would have been in the wings, the knowledge of how far it was, how long the air lasted between one world and another, how the wind moved differently over the giant's territory than it moved over Asgard's walls. All of this would rest in the cloak's keeping until the next occasion called for it. If the next occasion ever came, the tradition does not record a third loan, only the two, both complete, both returned. What persists across both myths is the image of Freya giving the cloak, not reluctantly, not with conditions, giving it with something that the poetic Edda frames explicitly as a kind of absolute willingness. Even if it were gold, even if it were silver, she would give it. This framing is not incidental. It is, within the compressed economy of Eddic verse, a characterization. It says, this is how Freya understands the cloak's purpose, and this is how she understands her own relationship to it. She is its keeper. She is not its prisoner. The keeping is in service of the giving, and the giving is in service of whatever genuine need presents itself at her hall's door. The cloak is kept against the occasions that require it. When those occasions arrive, the cloak goes. The asterisk, Valsharmer asterisk, sits now in the tradition's keeping, the way it once sat in Freya's hall. Available, specific, its two recorded uses complete and intact in the text that preserved them. The word breaks apart into its two halves, asterisk valor, asterisk the falcon, asterisk ham, or asterisk the shape, a falcon shape that a self could step into and wear and move through the world inside, carrying the falcon's own knowledge of the air, kept in a wide hall, in a wide field by a goddess who gave it, both times, freely, its feathers holding, still, something of the cold places it was flown to, its loan made twice, its return made twice, and the giving itself, unhurried, immediate, without ceremony, the thing the tradition chose to record alongside everything else the cloak could do. 4 dwarves lived inside a rock. The medieval Icelandic source that records their names, preserved in the Flateyjarbók manuscript, a great compendium of Norse material written in the late 14th century, lists them as Alfrig, Dvalin, Berling, and Grer, and the naming of all 4 separately, one after the other, is the text's quiet way of saying that no single craftsman could have done what these 4 did together. A master smith works alone. 4 named smiths working in concert inside a sealed rock suggests something of a different order, an object whose making required every kind of skill that could be brought to bear on it, distributed among 4 sets of hands. The rock they worked inside is not located anywhere on a surviving map of the mythological landscape. The Sorla thought, the medieval Icelandic tale in which this episode appears, does not say where the dwarves lived or how Freya came to find them. What it says is that she found them, and that when she arrived, they were finishing the necklace that would become the Brisingamen. She stood at the entrance to their dwelling, and she saw what they had made. The text does not linger on the necklace's appearance in the way a jeweler's account might. What it records instead is the quality of want, a recognition so immediate that Freya offered gold and silver for the Brisingamen before any terms had been proposed. The dwarves refused. They looked at what she had brought, and they told her they had no interest in treasure because they already had the craft that produced treasure, and what they wanted instead was something that could not be made at a forge. Each of them wanted a knight in her company. There were 4 dwarves. 4 knights was the price. Freya agreed. She spent 4 nights in the dwelling inside the rock, and on the 5th morning she walked out into whatever passes for daylight in the outer reaches of that mythological geography, and the Brisingamen was around her neck. The Surla, thought her, is a late source. It belongs to a strand of Norse literature that scholars have noted contains Christian overlay. Odin, in the same text, behaves in ways that align him with a kind of dark lord demanding tribute, which sits awkwardly against his depictions elsewhere, and the transaction by which Freya acquired the necklace has been read and assessed differently across several centuries of scholarly engagement with the material. What the text preserves, whatever layer of revision sits on top of its older core, is a clear account of how the Brisingamen came to exist. 4 dwarves, a rock, an exchange, and a goddess who considered what was being asked and decided that the necklace was worth it. The name itself carries information. Brisingamen contains the Old Norse word *men*, meaning necklace or torque, a curved metal collar of the kind worn as an emblem of wealth and status across Germanic and Norse cultures. The first element, Brisinga, has been discussed and disputed, with some scholars connecting it to an otherwise unknown group called the Brisings, others connecting it to an Old Norse word for fire or brightness, suggesting the necklace's name encoded something about its quality of light. Neither reading has been definitively settled. What survives in the name is the sense of something precious and particular, distinct from any other necklace. The *men*, of the Brisings, or the burning necklace, or both at once, held in a compound that the tradition understood as pointing toward this specific object and no other. The Brisingamen appears across Old Norse literature not only as an object Freya possesses, but as a presence within the kenning tradition, the system of compressed poetic metaphors that structured skaldic verse. In that tradition, gold is called Freya's tears, or sometimes the tears of Van, a name or title associated with the goddess in certain kenning contexts. The kenning works because the myth held that Freya wept, and what fell from her eyes when she wept was gold. The necklace stands at the center of that association, so radiant, so intimately connected to the goddess who wore it, that the kenning makers reached for her image when they needed a word for the most precious metal they knew. There is something worth sitting with in that poetic structure. A kenning is a compression, a way of encoding more meaning into fewer words than a direct statement allows. When a skald wanted to say gold and reached instead for Freya's tears, the kenning carried along with it the full weight of the goddess's grief, her longing for Other, the husband, the tradition records as having disappeared and left her weeping as she searched and collapsed it into a single glittering image. Gold became the visual record of a goddess's sorrow. Preciousness and grief became two names for the same phenomenon. The most valued substance in the material world was understood, in the skaldic tradition, as what happened when a deity of love and beauty cried. The Brisingamen is described in the Prose Edda's Golfaginning as among the possessions that define Freya's identity. Snorri Sturluson, writing in 13th century Iceland, lists the things that characterize her: Folkvangra, Sessrumnir, the falcon cloak, the love poetry, the weeping of gold, and the necklace. It sits in the list alongside tools of magical travel and the Hall of the Dead as one of the markers by which Freya is known, not a peripheral detail of her mythology, but a central one, belonging to her as certainly as Mjolnir belongs to Thor or Gungnir belongs to Odin. Mjolnir and Gungnir are both, according to the tradition, dwarf-made. The great dwarf-made artifacts of Norse mythology form a recognizable category, objects whose craftsmanship exceeds what any other makers can achieve, whose functions carry a quality of the absolute, the hammer that always returns, the spear that never misses, the necklace that sits in the kenning for gold, as if the two are inseparable. Placing the Brisingamen alongside those two objects is not an accident of the sources. It places the necklace Freya wore against her throat in the same register as the weapons that define the two most powerful male figures in the Norse pantheon. The craftsmen who made it, Alfrig, Dvalin, Berling, and Greyr, working inside their rock, are understood by the tradition to have produced something of equivalent magnitude. Dvalin's name appears across several Old Norse sources, often in the company of Durin, the two of them named as the great dwarf ancestors, from whom runic knowledge and poetic mead eventually reach the living world. His presence in the list of the four craftsmen is a quiet signal from the tradition about the order of maker that was involved. A dwarf named in the context of runic knowledge and the oldest forms of wisdom is a dwarf whose work carries more than technical skill, a craftsman whose hands have touched the oldest materials in the mythological world. What those four dwarves made together inside their rock was the product of craft descended from the deepest sources the tradition knew. Freya wore the Brisingamen back to Asgard, and it became part of how she moved through the world. The Prose Edda and the broader skaldic tradition do not detail her daily life with it. What they record is what happened when it was taken from her. In the Sorlathat, the theft of the Brisingamen is set in motion by Odin. He wanted the necklace returned to him, whether as a test of Loki's capacity or for his own reasons, the text does not fully clarify, and he sent Loki to take it while Freya slept. The means of entry was the problem. Freya's hall was locked, the doors were shut, and the walls offered no visible passage. Loki walked around the outside of the hall, looking for a way in, and the gap he eventually found was barely a gap at all. A hole, the text says, no larger than a needle's eye, somewhere in the structure of the building. He transformed himself into a flea. The detail is precise in a way that mythological details sometimes are, specific enough to carry the logic of the transformation. A flea is not simply small. A flea is the particular shape of something that moves through surfaces, that exists at the threshold between inside and outside, that passes through what should keep it out, without disturbing the structure it passes through. To take the shape of a flea is to become, briefly, the kind of thing that locked doors do not stop, not because it has power over locks, but because it is too small to be the kind of thing a lock was designed to prevent. The hall's defenses were built against creatures of consequence. The flea-shaped figure that slipped through the needle-eye gap at the base of the wall was beneath the consideration of any door. Loki found Freya sleeping. The Brisingamen was around her neck, and its clasp was beneath her, resting against the surface she lay on, positioned in a way that would require her to turn over for the clasp to be accessible. He bit her carefully, the kind of bite designed to shift a sleeping person's position without waking them, and she turned in her sleep, and the clasp came into reach, and he took the necklace. He returned to his own shape and brought the Brisingamen to Odin. Freya woke to find the necklace gone. The Surla thought records her response at a level of detail that makes clear how immediately she understood what had happened, not simply that an object had been stolen, but that the theft had required Odin's authority to authorize it, which meant Loki had not acted alone. She went to Odin. She told him what she believed had happened. He confirmed it and described the terms under which he would return the Brisingamen. She would need to do something for him in exchange, a task of considerable weight that the text describes in terms of endless battle and the manipulation of kings. The necklace was returned. The terms were met. The transformation into a flea sits within the same broad territory of shape assumption that the tradition associates with Loki throughout his appearances in both the prose and poetic sources. He takes the shape of a mare in one myth, producing Sleipnir. He takes the shape of a salmon to evade capture. In the falcon cloak, borrowed from Freya herself, he travels to Jotunheimer more than once. The flea belongs to this pattern, another assumed shape, another borrowed or self-generated form, used for a specific purpose, and then discarded. What is notable about the flea transformation is its quality of reduction rather than majesty. The falcon shape carries speed and altitude, the quality of a predator moving through open sky. The flea shape carries something almost opposite, not elevation, but elimination, the deliberate reduction of a figure to something too small to matter. The recovery of the Brisingamen is documented in a separate tradition from the theft, preserved in different sources and carrying a different atmosphere. In the prose Edda Skaldska Parmal, Snorri records a kenning for Heimdall that identifies him as the possessor or seeker of the Brisingamen and connects this to a combat. The skaldic verse that underlies the prose account describes a fight over the necklace between Heimdall and Loki at a place called Singastein, a name that translates roughly as the single stone or the lone rock, a specific geographic marker in the mythological landscape whose location is given nowhere else in surviving texts. Both figures were in the forms of seals. The combat at Singastein is one of those mythological details that arrives with full confidence and minimal context. Two gods, one of them the guardian of Asgard, and the other the shape-shifting figure who had stolen the necklace, took the bodies of seals and fought for the Brisingamen on a rock somewhere at the edge of what the text seemed to imagine as water. Heimdall won. The Brisingamen went back to Freya. The seal shapes are not explained. The tradition offers them as a plain fact of what occurred at Singastein. Heimdall and Loki fought as seals, without providing the logic of why that particular transformation was chosen, or what rules governed combat in assumed animal form, or what the rocks and water of Singastein looked like in the mythological world's geography. This is not unusual in the Norse sources. The poetic Edda and the skaldic tradition frequently preserve the specific details of mythological events without the scaffolding that would make those details immediately intelligible. The event is remembered. The circumstances that would let a contemporary reader fully reconstruct it have not survived. What the tradition preserves completely is the outcome. Heimdall recovered the Brisingamen and returned it to Freya. The kenning tradition marks his role in that recovery. He is called in skaldic verse the seeker or possessor of the Brisingamen, a title that makes the recovery of the necklace part of how he is identified. In the same way that Freya's grief becomes the kenning word for gold, Heimdall's role in this particular combat becomes part of how the skaldic tradition locates him among the other gods. The Brisingamen moves through more than one figure's story. The dwarves who made it, Alfrig, Dvalin, Burling, and Grer, do not appear again in the narrative. Their work was to make the necklace. Once it was made and the exchange was complete, they withdraw from the tradition's account entirely, which is a recognizable pattern in the myths of great dwarf-made objects. The makers of Mjolnir and Gungnir are not continuously present in those weapon stories either. The dwarves' function in these myths is to produce an object of such quality that the story of the object can sustain itself without them, and then to recede. Their craft continues in the object. Their names continue in the naming of the four craftsmen, carried in the Sorlathot as the record of who was responsible for what the tradition holds as one of the great artifacts of the Norse mythological world. There is an older strand of scholarly argument about the Brisingamen that connects it to a category of ritual or cultic objects in pre-Christian Germanic and Norse practice. Sacred necklaces or torques associated with female divine figures, carried in procession, worn as markers of a goddess's presence in ritual contexts. The argument draws on archaeological finds from the migration period and earlier, on the representation of female figures in Germanic and Scandinavian material culture, and on the general pattern by which the great objects of Norse mythology often encode in their narrative forms, something that had older roots in practice and belief. This reading holds the Brisingamen as not simply a story object, but as the mythological form of something that people once wore or carried or venerated in ways the narrative tradition has transformed into the shape of a theft and a recovery. What the surviving texts hold, regardless of the older layers the Brisingamen may encode, is a consistent account of what the necklace meant within the Norse literary tradition as it was written down. It was made by four of the finest craftsmen the mythological world contains, in an exchange that the tradition records without editorial judgment. It was worn by the goddess associated with love, desire, beauty, and the magical manipulation of fate. It was stolen by the figure most practiced in passing through the barriers other beings cannot. It was recovered by a fight on a rock at the edge of water, in the bodies of seals, by the god who watches every boundary in the Norse cosmos, and it was returned to Freya's neck, where the skaldic kenning tradition locates it, close enough to her that gold, the most precious metal in the world, those poets knew, takes its poetic name from her weeping. The kenning tradition is worth dwelling in a moment longer, because of what it reveals about how the Brisingamen was understood by the people who composed and transmitted these verses across several centuries of Old Norse literary culture. A kenning for gold that reaches for Freya's tears is not simply a decorative metaphor, not simply an elusive way of saying a common thing. Kennings in skaldic verse were understood as carrying precise mythological content. A skald who called gold Freya's tears was invoking a specific goddess, a specific grief, a specific mythological event. The listener or reader who received that kenning was expected to know the tradition behind it, to know that Freya wept, that what she wept was gold, and that the necklace was at the center of the constellation of sorrow and radiance that made her weeping a valid anchor for the word. Gold, in that kenning, is made of the same substance as divine grief. The precious and the sorrowful are not separate categories. The metal that a culture used to measure value, to mark beauty, to indicate power, that metal is understood in the skaldic tradition as the material form of what a goddess lost and continues to mourn. Whatever specifically generated Freya's weeping in the various strands of the tradition. The Brisingamen stands close to the center of it, as both the object of greatest beauty she possesses and the object that was taken from her and had to be recovered before it could return to the place it belonged. The cold of Singestein, that unnamed rock at the edge of unnamed water, would have been on the necklace when Heimdall brought it back. The seal shapes discarded, the combat resolved. The Brisingamen moved from Heimdall's keeping back to Freya's neck, and the skaldic poets could reach for it again when they needed the word for gold, and the kenning settled back into place, and the association between Freya's tears and the most valued metal in the world resumed in the tradition as though the interruption had not occurred. The Brisingamen is among those objects in the Norse mythological world that seem to generate story rather than simply appear within it. Mjolnir is stolen, recovered, used. Gungnir is thrown. The great objects move and are sought and change hands and return to their owners, and in each movement they accumulate the narrative of their passage through other figures' stories. The Brisingamen passed through 4 dwarves' hands as they made it. It passed from Freya to the dwarves across 4 nights and back. It passed through Loki's flea shape in the dark of a locked hall. It passed through 2 seals on a rock, and each passage left some record, a kenning, a name preserved in a manuscript, a combat that became part of how one god is identified in skaldic verse, so that the necklace, even when it is not being directly described, continues to be present in the tradition as a kind of recurring gravity. The 4 names, Alfrig, Dvalin, Burling, Grare, are their own kind of record, in a tradition that often leaves makers anonymous. Preserving the names of the 4 craftsmen is a specific act of attribution. The Flyjarbok, the manuscript that contains the Surla Thought, was compiled in the late 14th century, roughly 3 centuries after Iceland's conversion to Christianity, drawing on older oral and written material that reaches back into the pre-Christian Norse world. That the names of the 4 dwarves survived the transmission across those centuries through conversion and the slow transformation of the literary culture that preserved this material suggests they were understood as worth keeping. The Brisingamen was not a nameless object made by unnamed figures. It was a specific thing made by specific makers in a specific arrangement, and the tradition saw fit to preserve that specificity, folding it into the account of how the necklace came into Freya's possession and what it cost to bring it out of the rock. Dvalin's name, as noted, appears in other contexts in the oldest layers of Norse tradition, in the poetic Eddas, Havamal, among the dwarves associated with runic knowledge. Berling, Alfrig, and Grare are less widely attested, but in the Surla Thotri's account, their names carry equal weight. 4 masters, not a hierarchy of 1 master and 3 assistants. The craft was distributed, and the names are distributed, and what came out of that distribution was the Brisingamen, a necklace whose radiance the skaldic tradition treated as the defining image of gold itself. When Freya walked out of the rock after 4 nights and began the journey back to Asgard with the Brisingamen around her neck, she carried more than a piece of exceptional jewelry. She carried what 4 named dwarves had poured their craft into, the object that would eventually generate kennings for gold, the necklace that Loki would become a flea to steal, and that Heimdall would become a seal to recover. She carried the thing that a skaldic poet, centuries later, would reach for when they wanted a word for precious metal, finding it not in the nature of ore or mining, but in the image of a goddess weeping, the golden tears falling from a divine face as the mark of something deeply and permanently valued. The rock the dwarves worked inside is not located anywhere, Singastein, the rock where the fight took place, is not located anywhere either. The Brisingamen exists in the Norse tradition, in a geography that is felt rather than mapped, somewhere beyond Asgard, somewhere at the edge of water, somewhere inside a darkness that four craftsmen turned into light with their work. What the tradition holds is the shape of the object's passage through the world, made, exchanged, worn, stolen, fought over, recovered, returned, and in the skaldic kenning, still there. Gold still carrying Freya's tears inside it as its poetic name. The necklace still present in the image every time a poet reached for a compression that would make precious metal felt rather than merely named. A word for gold that carries inside it the record of a goddess's grief, and in that grief, the radiance of the most valued thing four dwarves were ever asked to make. A raised platform of wood stood a little above the floor of the hall, set apart from everything around it by the simple fact of elevation. Not high, only enough to mark it as a different kind of place, a surface where the ordinary rules of standing and sitting did not quite apply. Below it, arranged in a particular configuration that the texts do not describe in architectural detail, but that the ritual required, a choir of assistants waited. What they were about to sing had a name, Vard Lokor, a word sometimes translated as wardlocks or spirit songs, a form of chanting whose purpose was to call something close that would otherwise remain at a distance. The platform was called the Scythhjalar. The practice was called Scyther. And in the Norse tradition, the figure at the origin of that practice, the one from whom it passed into the world of the Aesir gods, the one who had always known it, was Freya. In mangas recorded across the sagas and Eddic literature as a form of magic involving altered states of consciousness, contact with spirits, prophetic vision, and the capacity to influence fate itself, not to observe it passively, but to find it and change it, the way a weaver might locate a thread in a piece of cloth and pull it in a different direction. What the Norse sources describe is not a single dramatic act, but a practice with a specific physical setting, a specific set of ritual requirements, a specific tradition of transmission. The Scythhjalar was its platform, the Vardlukur was its music, the trance was its method, and Freya was, as the Ynglinga saga records directly, the first to bring this practice to the Aesir, the one who carried it from the Vanir world across whatever distance lay between those two divine communities, and taught it. The Ynglinga saga is one of the foundational texts of Norse mythology, compiled in the 13th century by Snorri Sturluson from older materials he had access to, and in it the transmission is described plainly. Freya taught Odin Scyther. This is stated not as a secondary detail, but as one of the significant facts of Odin's character, that the magic most associated with his identity, the deep shamanic practice that underlies so much of what makes him the kind of god he is, was not originally his. He learned it. He received it from someone who already held it, and that someone was Freya, in a tradition that attributes to Odin enormous magical power and places him at the summit of the divine order. This is a remarkable piece of accounting. The most powerful figure in the Norse cosmos learned his deepest art from someone else. The word Scythra may itself carry a clue about how the practice was imagined. Some scholars have proposed a connection to Old Norse words for cord or binding, seathred, roots that suggest something pulled taut, something under tension, something that can be adjusted by a hand that knows how to find the thread. Whether or not the etymology holds in every detail, the image it suggests fits the practice as the sources describe it. Fate, in the Norse understanding, was not fixed beyond all reach. It was more like a structure with moving parts, woven or braided, held together in a particular configuration but not entirely immune to the hands of someone who understood the weave. Scyther was the practice of finding those threads. The platform was where the practitioner sat while they looked. The capabilities attributed to Scyther in Old Norse sources are varied enough that the practice resists any single summary. It could be used to look into the past, to recover knowledge of something that had already happened and left no visible trace. It could be used to look into the future, to see the shape of what had not yet arrived, and to carry that knowledge back to whoever had asked the question. It could alter the fate of an individual or a community, turning what had been heading in one direction toward a different outcome. It could project the practitioner's consciousness into distant places while the body remains seated on the scythial, a form of travel that left no visible trace of departure and no visible trail of return. And it could influence the will of other people, bending thought and desire in ways that the sources describe, sometimes neutrally and sometimes with a wariness that acknowledged the magnitude of what such influence would mean. None of these capabilities, individually, is unique to Scyther in the broader context of Norse magical thinking. What makes Scyther distinctive is the combination, the scope of what it could address, the altered state required for its practice, the specific ritual architecture of platform and chant and assistance, and above all the tradition that connected its origins to the Vanir and its transmission specifically to Freya. This was not the magic of runes which Odin won by other means and which operated through inscription and form. This was something older in the tradition's own accounting, something that arrived in Asgard from outside it, carried by a goddess whose nature was entirely congruent with what she was teaching. For Freya, Scyther was not transgressive, it belonged to her. The question of transgression is worth sitting with, because Snorri Sturluson addresses it explicitly in the Ynglinga saga, and it illuminates something important about what the Norse tradition understood itself to be doing when it assigned this practice to Freya rather than to a male god. Snorri records that the practice of Scyther by men was considered *ergi, asterisk, a charged word in Old Norse that carried connotations of unmanliness, of the kind of gender transgression that the culture viewed with a particular and specific discomfort. It was not simply that the practice was considered unusual for men to undertake. It was that something in the nature of Scyther, the passivity required by trance, the receptivity, the particular relationship to hidden knowledge that involved being entered by information rather than seizing it, was understood as being fundamentally not a masculine way of moving through the world. For Odin to practice Scyther was therefore a transgression, and the texts acknowledge this. Snorri notes it. Other sources use *ergi*, and its related terms in relation to Odin's shamanic practices in ways that suggest the culture was aware of the tension and did not erase it. Odin performed this magic anyway. He accepted what the transgression cost him in terms of the culture's understanding of proper masculine divine behavior, because the magic was worth the cost. What this reveals is not primarily something about Norse gender structures, though it does reveal something about those, but something about the scale of what Scyther was understood to be. Its power was great enough that the most powerful figure in the Norse cosmos would accept social diminishment in order to possess it. That is a particular kind of valuation. For Freya, none of this applied. The practice was hers by nature. Scyther was not transgressive for a Vanir goddess whose domain already included fertility, desire, the governance of the honored dead, and a form of magic so intrinsic to her identity that her name and her practice could not be cleanly separated. She did not adopt Scyther from outside herself. She was, in the tradition's own language, the one who brought it, which means that when Odin learned it from her, The direction of transmission was clearly established. The magic flowed from Freya to Odin, from Vanir to Aesir, from a goddess whose nature contained the practice entirely, to a god who would carry it imperfectly, marked by the cost of crossing into it. The Vardlokur chanting that assisted the Seidr practitioner into trance is documented in detail in Eirik's Saga Rautha, the saga of Eric the Red, where a prophetess called Thorbjörg visits a Norse settlement in Greenland and performs a Seidr rite that is described with enough specific detail to suggest the author had access to real knowledge of how such rituals were conducted. The prophetess requires a choir of women to sing the Boablok. She climbs onto the prepared platform. She enters her trance state. She is then able to answer questions about the future of the community, about what the coming season will bring, about matters of individual fate, about conditions that cannot be determined through ordinary observation. The saga records her answers as accurate. What the ritual in Eirik's Saga Rautha describes is a specific social function, the community arranging itself around the Scythialj in a particular configuration, so that knowledge otherwise inaccessible can be made available. The Vardlokur did not begin the trance directly. It called the spirits near, that the trance would then allow the practitioner to engage. Voices first, then silence, then the deeper attention that silence opened. There is something in the architecture of this that rewards consideration. The Seidr rite, as the sagas describe it, was not a solitary practice. It required the assembled voices of the Vardlokur choir, required the physical presence of the platform, required the community to gather itself around the practitioner and participate in the making of the conditions that made the rite possible. The prophetess could not do it alone. The knowledge she was reaching for could not be reached without the particular acoustic and social environment that the ritual created. This is different from the image of a lone sorcerer working in private, drawing on individual power applied through individual will. Seath, as the saga tradition describes it, was embedded in collective participation. The choir created something the practitioner then entered. Freya is the figure who carries this practice at its source, not a practitioner of it at one remove, not someone who learned it from another. The tradition identifies her as its origin within the world of the Norse gods, the point from which it spread outward into a cosmos that had not previously held it. And this origin story matters not as a biographical detail about a fictional figure, but as a record of how the Norse tradition understood the relationship between the Vanir and the Aesir, between the gods associated with fertility and natural magic and the gods associated with war and sovereignty, between what Freya represented and what Odin represented. When Freya taught Odin Seidr, the tradition was describing a transfer of something precious across a boundary between two different kinds of divine power. What Odin gained from Freya was not a supplementary skill. It was a way of knowing the world that he had not been able to access before she gave it to him. The word mansung appears in the Old Norse legal tradition as a category of prohibited speech. It means something close to love song or maiden song, and its prohibition in medieval Icelandic law was specific. The composition of certain kinds of amorous poetry directed at a real named woman was illegal. Not all poetry about love or desire. The Norse skaldic tradition was deeply invested in both, but poetry of a particular kind, in which the language was shaped and directed toward a specific living person in ways the law recognized as capable of causing harm. Freya was the divine patron of Kurat Munsurg. The erotic verse belonged to her domain in the same way that Seidr did, and the connection is not incidental. What Seidr could do to fate and to the consciousness of others, Mansur could do through language, find a way into what was otherwise closed off, move something in a particular direction, create conditions in the person it reached that the person had not chosen and might not be able to resist. The prohibition was not symbolic. Medieval Icelandic law was a functioning legal system with real consequences for violations, and the category of mansung was taken seriously enough to encode in statute. What this means is that the culture believed, with enough conviction to legislate it, that certain kinds of language directed at a person in a particular way could cause real effects. Poetry was not merely expressive. Certain poetry, composed correctly and aimed correctly, could move a feeling across a room, or across a season, or across whatever distance separated the one who composed it from the one at whom it was directed. Freya's patronage of this form gave it divine authority and placed it within the same domain as Scyther, the capacity to find what was hidden, to move what was apparently fixed, to make something happen that ordinary action could not accomplish. There is a coherence to Freya's domains that becomes clearer the further into them one looks. Fertility, desire, the honored dead, the falcon cloak that allows travel between worlds, the Brisingamen that concentrates radiance and carries grief in the kenning tradition, and now Scyther and mansung, and the capacity to reach into the fabric of fate and know it from the inside. These are not separate powers assembled arbitrarily around a single figure. They are expressions of a single underlying principle, the capacity to penetrate surfaces, to move through what appears closed, to know what is hidden, to affect what presents itself as fixed. The asterisk Velshammer. Asterisk allowed its wearer to pass through the air in a form that the air did not resist. Scyther allowed the practitioner to pass through the barrier between ordinary consciousness and the knowledge of fate. Mansung allowed certain words to pass through the ordinary resistance of a person's interior life and find their way into it directly. What the tradition gathered around Freya was not a collection of distinct attributes, but a single capacity expressed in multiple registers. The Ynglinga saga describes Freya's transmission of Scyther to Odin in the context of a broader account of the Vanir gods' nature and the gifts they brought to the Aesir. The Vanir, in Snorri's framing, were associated above all with prosperity, fertility, and this form of magical knowledge, Scyther, that the Aesir did not originally possess. The transfer of Njord, Freyr, and Freya to Asgard was therefore also, on this reading, a transfer of a certain kind of knowledge. The Vanir were not simply exchanged as divine hostages to secure a peace agreement. They brought with them ways of knowing the world that changed what Asgard was capable of. And of all the knowledge that moved in that transfer, Scyther was the deepest, the practice that reached into the structure of fate itself and operated from within it. The Scythe stood in whatever hall or outdoor space the rite required, and the assistants arranged themselves below it, and the Vard Lokor began that specific chanting whose purpose was not music in any decorative sense, but the creation of conditions, the calling near of what the practitioner would need to engage. The sound filled whatever space the ritual occupied. It was, in a sense, the ritual's most visible component. The platform was static. The trance was interior, but the chanting was something that happened in the air between the participants and could be heard by anyone present. The community gathered around its center of hidden knowledge and sang it open. Scyther's capacity to project consciousness into distant places is worth dwelling on because it sits at an interesting intersection with other forms of travel and transformation documented in the Norse tradition. The falcon cloak allowed its wearer to travel in a physical animal form, to move through the sky as a bird, carrying in the body of a falcon the consciousness and intention of a god. Hemfara, The practice of traveling in assumed animal form was related to Scyther in the broader tradition of Norse shamanism, and both belonged to the same conceptual territory. The idea that consciousness was not necessarily confined to its ordinary location, that it could be projected, relocated, sent ahead of the body, or beyond it. The Scythialer was where the body remained, while the awareness moved. The falcon cloak was where the body itself was transformed so that it could move through a different medium, different mechanisms, related principles. The Norse tradition documented both practices across its oldest surviving sources, the Prose Edda and the Poetic Edda, the family and king's sagas, the law codes, the skaldic verse that preserved its kennings across centuries of transmission. The consistency of Scyther's presence across these different kinds of text is significant. It was not a marginal element of the tradition, a late addition, or a regional variation. It appears in Snorri's encyclopedic account of Norse mythology, in the older Eddic poetry he was working from, in the sagas that describe the practice being performed by human seer, in historical Icelandic settings, in the legal codes that regulated forms of speech associated with its divine patron. What this breadth of documentation suggests is that Scyther was understood across the tradition, not as one kind of magic among many interchangeable types, but as a specific and recognized practice with a specific character, a specific requirement for ritual setting and collective participation, and a specific divine origin. Freya sat at that origin. The tradition gave her this place not incidentally, but as part of what she was. She was not a goddess who happened to know Scyther. She was the figure through whom Scyther entered the world of the Norse gods, the one who carried it in her nature before she carried it to Odin, the one whose very identity as a Vanir goddess made her the correct and inevitable source of a practice that was always going to be hers. When the Vardlokur rose from the assembled choir and the practitioner on the Scythehjal began to reach through the surface of ordinary consciousness toward the structure of fate, underneath it, the tradition that made that practice possible led back to Freya, to the Vanir world she came from, to the divine nature she brought with her when she crossed into Asgard, carrying her people's knowledge in her keeping. The raised platform of the Scythehjal is a small thing in one sense, a piece of constructed wood set above a floor, but in the ritual it organized, it was the center of something that reached further than the hall containing it. From the platform, through the trance, through whatever the Verlocker called near, the practitioner could look into time, could look across distance, could find the thread of someone's fate and know what it was weighted toward, could return from that looking with knowledge that could not have been gathered any other way, in a language the community waiting below the platform might, or might not, have the vocabulary to receive. The platform was built small. What happened on it was not. Snorri Sturluson's treatment of Scyther in the Ynglinga saga is careful in a way that rewards attention. He records Freya as its origin. He records Odin as its student. He records the asterisk ergi, asterisk designation, the cultural weight of the practice's transgression for a male practitioner without resolving or softening it. He was a Christian scholar in the 13th century, writing about the religious practices of his Norse ancestors, and his relationship to the material he was recording was therefore complex in ways he himself did not fully articulate, but the detail he preserved is the detail that matters for what the tradition believed, that Scyther was Freya's, that Odin learned it from her, and that the learning cost Odin something even as it gave him something enormous. The asymmetry is the interesting thing. Freya gave without losing. Odin received and was marked by the receiving. The law that prohibited mansung was probably not, primarily concerned with the feelings of the women at whom such verse might be directed, though the harm to reputation that certain kinds of public erotic poetry could cause would have been real and recognized. The concern encoded in the prohibition was with the power of the poetry itself, the belief that words shaped in a particular way and aimed at a particular person could do something to that person that the person had not consented to. This is a legal acknowledgement of a magical principle. The law was not protecting against mere bad poetry. It was protecting against a specific form of directed verbal force, the kind that Freya's patronage consecrated, that operated in the same register as Scyther's influence over the will, that shared with the deeper practice the quality of penetrating what should have been closed. The connections accumulate quietly. Scyther reaches into fate and knowledge. Mansung reaches into the interior life of the person at whom it is directed. The falcon cloak reaches through the medium of air to carry its wearer between worlds. The Brisingamen, in the kenning tradition, turns grief into gold, transforms the interior experience of loss into something that catches light. What gathers around Freya in the tradition is not a set of powers, but a coherent quality of attention, the capacity to find what is hidden inside things, to move through surfaces, to know what cannot be seen from the outside, to carry knowledge and feeling and transformation across whatever barriers exist between one state and another. She taught the most powerful figure in the Norse cosmos to do what she already knew how to do. She taught him the practice that required him to accept its costs, because the practice was worth more than the costs were. And in teaching him, she did not diminish what she held. The tradition does not record Odin taking Scyther from Freya in the way that one figure's gain comes at another's loss. He learned it. She still had it. That is how knowledge of this kind moves, not transferred like an object from one hand to another, but shared across a relationship, with both parties changed by the sharing and neither depleted. The Scythial stood in its particular place. The choir arranged below it began to sing. The practitioner climbed onto the platform and sat and moved slowly into the altered state that the Varlokur was opening. Somewhere in the Norse cosmological geography, in the world of the Vanir, whose origins lay by the sea, and whose nature was tied to fertility and deep magical knowing, this practice had always been present, older than the peace between Aesir and Vanir, older than the exchange that brought Freya to Asgard, older than whatever moment the tradition imagined as the first time a figure climbed onto a raised platform and allowed the chanting to call something close. The practice was already fully formed when Freya carried it. She did not invent it within the tradition's own accounting. She was the one who held it. Fate, in the Norse tradition, was not a single fixed destination toward which all events moved. It was something more like a current, a direction that things were moving in, a pull that could be felt and read, and by those with the knowledge redirected. The Norns at the Well of Earth wove fate from their position at the cosmological center. The the Sirates, who practiced Scyther in the human world, read fate from the raised platform of the Scythial with their choir assembled below them, and Freya sat at the source of the entire tradition, not weaving fate like the Norns, not reading it from a platform for a gathered community in the way the saga Sirius did, but holding the knowledge of how to reach it, how to enter it, how to teach another figure to find the thread and know it for what it was. The practice required patience. The trance did not arrive quickly. The Varlokur had to continue, and the practitioner had to remain on the platform and allow the deepening to happen at whatever rate the spirits required. This is not the kind of magic that produces immediate spectacular results, flash and transformation, and sudden disclosure. It is a practice with a particular tempo, a slow and inward tempo, a movement that looks from the outside like stillness and is from the inside an experience of tremendous depth. The platform held the practitioner in the middle of the hall. The choir held the practitioner in the middle of the sound, and from that held position, surrounded and contained, the practitioner moved through to where the hidden things were. In medieval Icelandic law, the prohibition on mansung stood in the legal record as a quietly extraordinary artifact, a statute that functioned as an acknowledgement of the power of desire, the power of language, and the power of their combination when directed with enough skill and intention at a real person. Freya's patronage of this form of verse was not incidental decoration on her divine profile. It placed the most intimate form of human longing, the desire that reaches toward a specific person and asks to be received under her governance in the same way that Scyther placed the knowledge of fate under her original ownership. Both were about the gap between what could be reached through ordinary means and what required a different kind of approach. Both were about penetrating a surface. Both were hers. The hall in which the Scythjall stood is not named in any specific text as Freya's hall, because the platform was wherever the rite required it to be, in a Norse settlement in Greenland, in a skaldic saga, in whatever imagined location the tradition placed its practitioners. The practice moved through the tradition, carried by figures who had learned it and who carried it further. But the tradition that recorded all of these instances, the seeress in Eirik Saga Raudha climbing her platform while the women around her sang, Buken Seiding Wow, Tu Artharetrentiri Hoke. The Ynglinga Saga's account of Odin learning from Freya what he could not have discovered alone located the origin of the entire tradition in a single figure who stood before the transmission began, holding in her nature the practice that would eventually spread through the Norse divine world and into the human world that the gods reflected and shaped. What the law prohibited, it also confirmed. The legal category of mansung did not exist in medieval Icelandic law because the culture was indifferent to the power of certain kinds of erotic verse. It existed because the culture believed in that power. The statute was a record of the belief, and the belief pointed back, through Freya's patronage, to the same principle that Scyther enacted on a larger scale, that knowledge and desire and certain precisely shaped uses of language carried the capacity to move through things, to find what was hidden in them, to change what was otherwise resistant to change. The magic was real in the tradition's own terms. The law was written around the edges of that reality, and Freya stood at the center of it, the figure whose nature had always contained this capacity, who had taught it to the most powerful god in the Norse cosmos, and who had been neither diminished by the teaching nor reduced by the sharing to a simpler or smaller version of what she was. The Scythjallir is a particular piece of wood. The Vardlokur is a particular kind of chanting. The trance is a particular quality of attention, and the figure who stands at the origin of all of it is particular too, not a symbol of magic in the abstract, not a generalization about Vanir nature or feminine divine power, but a specific goddess whose name meant lady in the oldest Germanic root, and whose practice reached further than that title suggested, down into the structure of fate itself, into the hidden current beneath the surface of things, into the slow and patient knowledge of what was already there, waiting for a practitioner who knew how to find it and was willing to climb onto the platform and begin. The love song directed at a specific woman was illegal in medieval Icelandic law, and the law was written because someone believed the song could work. In that belief, which was old enough to require legislation, which was specific enough to name its divine patron, There is a small and persistent record of what the Norse tradition understood Freya's domain to be. Not merely the beautiful, not merely the desired, but the powerful, the kind of power that operates quietly through penetration rather than force, through knowledge rather than conquest, through the shaped and patient attention of something that has always known how to find the thread. In the Eddic poem Grimnismal, Odin speaks a list of places. He names them one by one, each realm and hall in its proper order, and when he reaches the ninth, counted from the first, he names Folkvang, the field of the host, the field where Freya chooses. The words he uses are plain. Half of the slain in every battle, he says, she takes for her own. The other half comes to him. There is no hierarchy encoded in the accounting. There is no suggestion that his half is the more honored, or that her field is a lesser arrangement, made for those the greater hall could not accommodate. The division is equal, stated matter-of-factly, as though it describes something that has been true since before the recording of it, an arrangement older than the poem, older than the manuscript that holds the poem, ere older than the hands that copied it onto vellum in Iceland in the 13th century. Half to Freya, half to Odin. This is simply how it goes. What Odin's words point toward, when read slowly in the dark, is a field, not a hall first, not a throne or a gate or a set of described roads leading inward to a known destination. A field, wide, open, its name built from two ordinary words that together mean something like the place where the people are gathered. The Old Norse asterisk folk asterisk for host or people, the Old Norse asterisk Vangr asterisk for field or plain. Folkvangr does not encode grandeur in its name the way Valhalla does, with its spear-hung roof and its imagery of the warrior's ideal afterlife. Folkvangr is named for the simple fact of people in an open place, and that plainness of naming is itself a kind of information about what the field is, wide, receiving, unenclosed. The texts do not describe its edges. They do not say where the field ends or what lies at its borders. Valhalla accumulates descriptions across multiple sources. Its 540 doors, the goat Heithrun on its roof, the daily combat of the Einherjar, who fight from dawn to dusk and are healed each evening. Folkvangr accumulates almost nothing of this kind. It stands in the sources as an open space named for its occupants, presided over by Sessrumnir, and the absence of detailed description gives it a quality that is, in its own way, more spacious than any description could provide. What is fully described has defined limits. What the texts leave open can extend as far as the mind allows. Sessrumnir stands in that field. Its name, in Old Norse, carries its defining quality inside it. Asterisk ses, asterisk for seat, room for space or room, and from these two syllables placed together, the name means something like seat roomy, or with room enough for many seats, or a hall in which there is room for everyone who comes. The Prose Edda's Gylfaginning describes it as large and beautiful, which is the kind of description that gestures toward a quality without fully rendering it, and the largeness is not an accident of the telling. A hall named for its internal space, set in a field named for the many people gathered there, is a hall whose primary identity is welcome. Not defense, not display, not the enclosed and ordered martial world of Valhalla's daily ritual. Welcome, the particular quality of a structure built wide enough to receive whoever arrives. The goddess whose hall it is does not appear in most accounts as a figure of enclosure. Freya moves. She is associated with the falcon cloak that allows flight, with the practice of Scyther, whose more advanced forms involve projecting awareness across distance. With wandering, her search for Other takes her across the 9 worlds and into the realms of peoples who do not know her name. She is a figure who goes out into what is distant and unfamiliar, and yet the hall she returns to is defined above all by the space inside it. This is not a contradiction. The hall wide enough to hold many is also the hall wide enough to hold a goddess who ranges far and returns with the cold of other worlds still on her. The question of who exactly occupies Sessrumnir is one the surviving sources do not fully resolve. The Einar Jar, Odin's chosen dead, have a documented existence in Valhalla that involves daily combat, daily death, daily renewal, and nightly feasting in preparation for the final conflict at the end of the present age of the world. What Freya's half of the slain do in Folkvang, the texts do not specify with the same clarity. The Prose Edda's Gylfaginning acknowledges the existence of both realms, but expends far more attention on Valhalla's routines. What happens on the other side of the division, in the wide field, inside the roomy hall, is not described in the same way, which leaves the nature of existence in Sessrumnir as something that later readers have had to approach through inference and careful attention to what little the sources provide. Some scholars who have worked closely with Old Norse religion and its afterlife traditions have noted the ambiguity and treated it as potentially meaningful in itself. The absence of a detailed martial regimen for Freya's chosen dead has led to readings in which existence in Sessrumnir might be understood as less structured or differently structured than the cyclical combat and feasting of Valhalla, a kind of rest, perhaps, rather than preparation. The sources do not confirm this, but they do not contradict it either, and the name of the hall, which encodes spaciousness rather than purpose, sits quietly alongside the possibility. What the tradition does describe more fully is the category of divine figures associated with Freya's domain over battle and the dead. The Disir, female ancestral spirits in Old Norse belief, appear across the sagas and Eddic literature as powers connected to fate, fertility, and protection, associated with specific families and honored in ceremonies held in the late autumn or early winter. In their warlike aspect, the Disir move close to the Valkyries, figures of divine feminine power whose relationship to death is not simply one of mourning, but of choosing, of directing, of holding some authority over who falls and who does not. Freya stands in the tradition as a figure who gathers these associations without being entirely subsumed by any one of them. She chooses the slain. She receives them in her hall. She presides over a field whose name says, simply and without elaboration, that there are many people there. The scholar Hilda Roderick Ellis Davidson, working through the surviving evidence of Old Norse afterlife belief, proposed that Freya may have functioned in earlier strata of the tradition as something like a leader or archetype of the Valkyries themselves, a figure from whom that entire category of divine feminine agency over death and battle derived. The Valkyries choose who dies and carry the honored dead to their destinations. Freya receives half of them at her own destination. The structural relationship between these functions is close enough that reading one as derived from the other requires only a moderate extension of what the evidence provides. Whether or not the derivation is historical, in the strict sense, the pattern is consistent. Freya and battle, Freya and the dead, Freya and the passage from one state to another, is a relationship the tradition maintains across its oldest surviving layers. The field receives. That is the consistent image. Folkvanger is not described as a place that takes something from its occupants, not a place of testing, or of further ordeal, or of daily renewed difficulty. It is described in the most economical terms the sources allow, as a field that holds people, and a hall that holds seats, and a goddess who chose her half of the slain and brought them there. The economy of the description may be a function of what survived and what did not. Norse mythology as it exists now is an incomplete record, filtered through Icelandic Christian scribes whose investment in the martial Valhalla tradition was not necessarily matched by equal attention to Freya's realm. What came through is enough to hold the shape of the place without filling it in. The shape is wide. That is worth sitting with. In a mythological tradition that gives considerable space to enclosure, the walls of Asgard, the locked doors of various halls, the 9 worlds separated from each other by significant and dangerous distances, Felkfangr, is named as something open, a field. The word asterisk fangr, asterisk is also used in Old Norse for a garden or meadow, a cultivated place rather than a wild one, which adds a quality of tending or care to the image. The field is not a wilderness. It is not the outer dark beyond the edges of the known world. It is a place presided over, and in the root meaning of its name's second element, cultivated, brought into a condition of habitation, and across that field, Sessrumnir, the hall that is named for room, the hall whose prose edda description notes that it is large and beautiful, but whose name quietly insists on the largeness above all else. The room, the space, the accommodation for more than could easily be counted. There is something particular about a hall whose primary quality is capacity rather than beauty or strength or the display of its owner's power. Such a hall is oriented outward rather than inward. It exists to hold what comes to it rather than to express what is already inside. Sessrumnir sits in its field with its doors, and the texts do not describe those doors as locked against anything, and the field continues around it in whatever direction the imagination follows. The half of the honored dead, who go to Freya rather than to Odin, go into this, into the wide field and the roomy hall, into the keeping of the goddess who came from the Vanir, who grew up at the edge of the sea in her father Njord's coastal world, who crossed the boundary between divine tribes when the Aesir-Vanir War ended in its truce, and carried with her a Vanir nature, associating her with fertility and growth and the living world's abundance that never entirely dissolved into the warrior culture of Asgard. Her half of the dead come to something that is shaped by what she is, not armor and daily combat, not the narrow business of preparation for a war at the end of time. Something wider, something whose name encodes only the fact of many people, and enough room to hold them. There is a further quality to Folkvang that the tradition silences preserve, and that is a kind of temporal openness. Valhalla is described with considerable attention to its eschatological purpose. The Einherjar are preparing for Ragnarok, the final conflict that will remake the world. Their daily combat is not pleasure, but training, not rest, but a state of perpetual readiness. The entire machinery of Valhalla is oriented toward an endpoint, a culminating event, a moment when its preparation will be called upon. Folkvangr is not described this way. If Freya's chosen dead are also in preparation for something, the texts do not say so. The field receives them and the hall holds them, and the purpose of this holding is not specified in eschatological terms. The field simply continues. Sessrumnir stands in it, large and beautiful and full, and the texts move on without closing the question. This is, in itself, a kind of image worth attending to, a place that is not oriented toward an end, a hall whose name describes only the present condition of its interior room, and the people in it without encoding any future purpose. Sessrumnir is defined by what it is, not by what it is for. That quality of simple present tense being, of existing without declared orientation toward anything beyond itself, gives the hall a restfulness that its few surviving descriptions carry even at the distance of centuries. The tradition that describes all of this was transmitted across a long arc of time before it was written down. The myths of Freya, her Vanir origins, her place among the Aesir, her magical authority, her grief, her ornament, her cloak, and her field circulated through oral tradition across the Norse world before the Christian period brought the scribal culture that eventually recorded them in Iceland. The manuscripts that now preserve the Prose Edda and the Poetic Edda were produced in the 13th century, but the material they contain is considerably older, its roots extending back into the pre-Christian Norse world, and further still into the Proto-Germanic and Proto-Indo-European cultural layers, from which Old Norse religion developed over centuries of gradual change. What the manuscripts hold is old enough that its oldest layers are not clearly visible, only their effects, their shapes in the surviving text, the patterns of repetition and association that suggest how deep the roots go. Freya's name carries this depth. The Proto-Germanic word Frauo, meaning lady or noblewoman, the title that became her name, and that her name eventually became, has cognates in Old High German, fruval, and in the modern German Frau a word used every day by ordinary speakers who carry inside it, worn smooth by centuries of use, the trace of a goddess's title. The reverence built into the term, its orientation toward a figure of feminine authority, traveled through languages and centuries and arrived in common speech as a polite form of address, still holding its original direction, still pointing toward the quality of the noblewoman in the original Proto-Germanic sense, not simply a woman of rank, but a woman of recognized power and distinction. Freya is called by a title that time turned into a common word, and the common word still remembers the title. The field she presides over has been named in that same unbroken way. Folkvanger is a compound whose elements are both still recognizable in modern Scandinavian languages, folk, people, the related word for field or plain, and the recognizability is not trivial. It means the name has never required translation for those who lived within the linguistic tradition it came from. The field was always simply the field of the people, the place where the many gathered. The hall within it was always seat roomy, always large enough, always defined by its welcome rather than its walls. Freya presides over this field now in the same sense that she has always presided over it, as a figure in a tradition that has never stopped being transmitted, even when the transmission changed form, even when the religious context that gave the tradition its original meaning was replaced by a different one. The myths of Freya passed from oral culture into manuscript culture, from religious tradition into literary tradition, from medieval Icelandic scribal practice into the scholarly and popular interest that has carried Norse mythology into the contemporary world. At each stage of this passage, Folkvangra remained a field. Sisrumnir remained a hall with room enough inside it. The half of the honored dead that belongs to Freya continued to belong to her. The continuity is unremarkable in one sense. Of course, traditions persist. That is what traditions do. But in another sense, the persistence of this particular image across such a long arc of transmission is worth the attention it deserves. The image of the wide field, the roomy hall, the goddess who chooses half the slain and receives them in a place whose name does not describe walls or gates or preparation for future conflict. This image was worth keeping. The people who kept it, across every stage of the tradition's long journey, from pre-Christian Norse religion to contemporary knowledge, found it worth preserving, not necessarily because they believed it in the way its original practitioners believed it, but because the image holds something that images hold when they are genuinely made, a quality that is not reducible to its component parts, a sense that the thing described is in some way real, even when the claim to literal truth is set aside. What that quality is in Folkvang is not easy to name, and perhaps should not be named too precisely. It has something to do with space, with the particular comfort of a place that is described as wide and receiving rather than enclosed and purposive. It has something to do with the equality of the arrangement, half to Freya, stated simply, equal to the half that goes to Odin, neither half being the lesser. It has something to do with the name Sessrumnir, which does not describe what the hall is for, but only what it has inside it. Room. Enough room. Room as the hall's defining quality, its primary gift. In the Norse tradition, Freya is not simply a goddess of love, though she carries that association, or simply a goddess of battle, though she carries that one too, or simply a sorceress, or simply the wearer of a famous necklace, or simply the owner of a cloak whose feathers carry the knowledge of how to ride the air. She is all of these things simultaneously and without apparent contradiction, which is characteristic of the way the older Norse sources present their divine figures as entities whose attributes do not simplify into a single function, but accumulate into something more complete and more genuinely strange than any single title can capture. She is the Vanir goddess in Asgard, carrying a nature that is not entirely of the warrior culture she now inhabits. She is the teacher of Scyther, whose deepest knowledge passed from Vanir to Aesir through her. She is the chooser of the slain and the keeper of the roomy hall, and the figure who wanders in grief across 9 worlds and returns. All of this, and the field that waits for her return, and the hall that always has enough room. The honored dead who come to Folkvanger come to a goddess who knows what it is to move through the world at distance from the place that is hers. They come to a hall that is named not for its threshold or its walls, but for the space inside. They come to a field without described edges, under a sky the texts do not specify, and settle into Sessrumnir's wide interior. Whatever the existence of the dead in that place is, and the sources, as noted, are quiet on this, they settle into something built for holding, not for driving forward. Outside the hall, the grass of Folkvanger continues. This is a simple image, and it does not require elaboration. Grass in an open field continues in the way that open fields continue, without urgency, without direction, responding to the slow changes of light and season in whatever way the mythological field responds to those things. The sources do not describe the weather in Folkvanger or the quality of the light there. They do not say whether the field is cold or mild, whether there is wind across it in the way there is wind across the coastal world where Freya's father Njord presides. The field holds its undescribed sky above it, and extends in its undescribed direction, and Sessrumnir stands in the middle of it, with the light of its interior, large and beautiful, the room inside it, full of what has been received. This is where Odin's words in Grimnismal arrive, at the 9th place in the list, after 8 other halls and realms have been named. Here is Folkvanger, and here Freya arranges the seating of the slain. The word used in some readings of the relevant passage for Freya's activity in the field suggests not passive reception, but active arrangement. She chooses, she places, she gives the dead their seats in the hall that is large enough. This active role in the reception of the dead is consistent with her broader identity in the tradition as a figure who exercises significant authority over things that most other divine figures do not control. The practice of Scyther gives its practitioner, in the oldest accounts, the ability to alter the fate of individuals and communities, to see into what is coming, and to adjust the threads of what is going to happen. A figure who commands those capabilities does not passively receive the dead. She chooses them, as Odin's own words say she does, and she arranges them in her hall, and the arrangement, whatever its shape, is hers. The Disir move through the tradition alongside this image of Freya and her field, these female ancestral spirits, understood in Old Norse belief as protective and fateful powers connected to specific family lines, were honored in ceremonies that situated them at the boundary between the living and the dead, at the time of year when the boundary was understood to be thinnest, when the relationship between ancestors and descendants was most available to attention. The connection between the Disir and Freya is not made explicit in every source, but the structural relationship is consistent enough that scholars working in this area have repeatedly returned to it. A divine feminine figure who presides over fate and death, who is associated with the fertility that connects generations, who chooses which of the slain come to her. Such a figure stands at the origin point of a whole category of divine feminine power over the relationship between living and dead. The category itself is old enough that its origin is not recoverable in any precise sense, only traceable backward into strata of Norse religion that predate the Christianization of Scandinavia and extend further still into the shared religious cultures of the Germanic and Indo-European worlds. Freya, at the center of this category, as the one who taught the magic of fate weaving, who chooses the dead, who receives them in her roomy hall, who wanders in grief and returns, is a figure whose identity has been accumulating for a very long time. What the surviving texts preserve is not the beginning of that accumulation, but a late moment in it, a snapshot of a tradition that was already ancient when the first skald composed a kenning that called gold her tears. The kenning tradition is worth returning to in this context. In the skaldic verse that preserved so much of what is known about Freya, gold is called by her name in various formulations. Freya's tears, Freya's weeping, associated with the radiance of the Brisingamen and with the grief of her wandering. The kenning works because it collapses the distance between two things, gold and the goddess's grief, into a single image that carries both simultaneously. Gold is precious and beautiful, and it catches the light in a particular way that is its defining quality, and grief is what remains when something precious has gone. The kenning says these two things are the same thing, or that they are made of the same material, or that one can stand for the other without loss of meaning. What the kenning encodes is not a description of gold as we would describe it now, nor a description of grief as psychology would frame it, but something else, a perception about the nature of preciousness, a sense that what is most valuable carries inside it the seed of what is most painful to lose. Freya, at the center of that perception, is Freya as the tradition most fully understood her. Not simply a goddess of desire, though desire is part of what she carries, but a figure who embodies the quality of what is most worth having and most impossible to hold without eventual loss. She is the goddess of gold and the goddess of grief, and these are not two aspects of her nature, but the same aspect seen from two different distances. Up close, the gold; at the distance of time, the grief. The kenning holds both distances at once. Folkvang holds its dead at the same kind of double distance. Close in the hall, the room for many seats, the largeness and beauty the sources note. Far in the field, the open ground without described edges, the name that encodes only the presence of many people and the space they occupy. The dead in Sessrumnir are received at close range, held in the specific physical fact of the hall and its room. The field around the hall is the distance, the wide, unhurried, undescribed plain that the name Folkvang reaches across without requiring walls to contain it. This is where the tradition settles, finally. In Grimnismal, Odin names the places in order, and Folkvangr is ninth. In Gylfaginning, the Prose Edda's framing dialogue describes the field and the hall in brief, plain terms, and moves on. In the Skaldic Kenning tradition, the associations accumulate, gold and grief, and the Brisingamen and the tears and the wandering, and Freya remains at the center of them, the figure around whom the Kennings orbit. In the scholarly tradition, the relationship between Freya and the Disir and the Valkyries and the oldest strata of Norse divine feminine power continues to be traced and retraced by those who find the pattern worth following. All of these threads arrive at the same field. The grass of Folkvang is not described as any particular kind of grass. The light over it is not given a color or a quality. The season is not named.